So up to this point, we've covered a lot of aspects of plant development and the plant life cycle. And we're moving on now into a topic that is basically in the field of plant physiology. So how plants function more on a molecular and cellular level. So hopefully this ties it all together. A lot of what we've covered so far, the different plant organs, plant needs, and so on. And so this is going to emphasize plant needs for water and how they get water, and also plant nutrients. So shown in this illustration, of course, a little plant leaf along with some water, kind of illustrating a feature that I don't know if everybody really thinks about the first time around. Plants above ground are pretty darn waterproof, right? So this leaf here might have lots of water on it, but the leaves are not adapted to make use of that water. So instead, this plant has to take up water from the roots and distribute that water from the roots to the leafy part of the plant. So how do you have a plant that's waterproof on the exterior surface get its water? Let's find out. So overall, we can look at the plant in a diagram here. Obviously, we've got the different organs, the above ground and below ground organs. We're back to considering just vegetative organs for now. And so water, as the emphasis of today's talk, how does water get through this plant? Well, we have the roots as the organs that are adapted to get water. We saw a little bit about water moving through the roots into the vascular system. And once it's in the vascular system, those are cells that are devoted to moving it up the plant. So specifically the xylem cells as those water moving cells, moving the water up the stem and out into the leaves where it can be used for photosynthesis. So looking at the whole plant as we think about the functions, the relative functions of the roots and the shoot, the root and shoot are having basically a trade-off in function. So the roots acquire water and make it available for the above ground parts of the plant, and the above ground parts of the plant are able to do photosynthesis. So those roots can get water, but they can't see the light. The leaves can see the light, but they can't get their own water. And so there's this trade-off in two parts, two of the ingredients that are important for photosynthesis, light and water. Photosynthesis happens in the leaves, and in exchange for the function of the roots, the leaves kind of pay them back by making sugar available, as we will see. So ultimately, this last term here, we'll talk about ultimately a lot of the water that comes through the plant actually ends up leaving from the leaves. So this little squiggly arrow here, this is indicating that some of that water actually makes it out through the pores in the leaves. A lot of the water does get used for photosynthesis, but some of it escapes through the leaves through the stomata. So we're going to start off from kind of a physics perspective, looking at the water movement, and we're going to use this term water potential. And there's this symbol here. This is the Greek letter psi or psi, and that's a symbol for water potential. And so you can actually measure the water potential. And when you think about water potential, I'd like you to think about it as the kind of the likelihood that water is going to move from one place to another. So there's going to be, as we'll see, a lot of different forces that act on the water molecules. And it's the cumulative effect of all those forces that determine whether water moves up or down, left or right from its one location. So this unit of water potential, we're going to see this in terms of numbers sometimes. I'm not going to dwell too much on the numeric version of water potential, but if you do see it as a number, then water moves from places where the water potential is high toward areas where water potential is low. So what causes water to move? This is a place where I usually stop and let students weigh in. What causes water to move? Let's think about it. All right, so let's say we've got a water molecule here. What causes water to move around? You can just think about water around your house, right? You pour water out of a glass and it goes down through the force of gravity. So really, as we're looking at a lot of these functions of the forces acting on water, most important might be the idea that this water molecule has to overcome gravity. I don't know what kind of plant that is. So moving up to the leafy part of a plant, getting water out of where it might be moist soil, that's got to overcome gravity. What causes water to overcome gravity? Let's say you spill your water on the countertop. Boy, drawing water is not the easiest thing. You could put a sponge down. Right? Sponges are pretty good at soaking up water. What causes water to go into a sponge? So the water will go into the sponge because this is capillary action. And also adhesion. So we know what sponges are made of, right? So we got a puddle of water here. And we saw earlier that sponges can be made out of cellulose, which is the same stuff you see on the outside of a plant cell that's making up the cell wall. And water is sticky for cellulose. So cellulose through hydrogen bonds. So basically the interaction of polar molecules, they are friendly with each other. So water can dissolve polar molecules. Water can also stick to polar molecules. And among those, cellulose can be a polar molecule. This causes water, if you stick a sponge over a puddle of water, the water will go up away from gravity into the sponge, right? Another property that affects water pressure, you might have done this in your introductory biology class. So if you put a cell or something with a membrane in it inside of water, if you put a cell or a membrane enclosed salty solution into water that's not very salty, then the water is drawn into that saltier solution because of the relative concentration. So in the water outside, this might be rather dilute solutes, not so salty water, maybe even distilled water, and it'll move into the saltiness of the cell or whatever you've got there through the process of osmosis. And this basically is a force that overwhelmingly pulls the water molecules not just evenly in the liquid, but toward the areas that are saltier. So kind of a variety of a lot of these different features cause water to move around. I guess one more I can illustrate here, as long as I'm drawing pictures for you. If you fill up a cup or graduated cylinder with water, that water can form a kind of a bulge on the top through the property of surface tension that holds those water molecules together and can cause them actually to be held together above the surface where they would normally maybe flow out of the top of this container. They're held together. This is the property of cohesion. So cohesion, a little bit different from adhesion. Cohesion is water sticking to water, and adhesion is water to something else. A little bit of a difference there. Okay, so I just want to kind of illustrate some of the forces that are acting on water, introduce those first, and then we'll see them in action in plant cells. So here's the first one, right? So you stick a plant inside of soil. If you put a plant in moist soil and the roots are drying out, so the plants kind of start off with their own water, but as they're drying out, if there's water in the environment and not a lot of water in the plant, then that water will be drawn towards the cells toward the cellulose around the cells, toward the interior of the cells as well, because of adhesion. So these water molecules basically sticking to the cells. The illustration here, this is a root along with a root hair in a kind of watery environment. And so this root hair is like a sponge extension from the root. And it comes out, and again, if this is relatively dry, then the moist soil is going to give up some of its water to the root hair there. And then that is, the root hair is connected to the sponginess of the root altogether, and that cellulose can basically pull the water in from the soil. The cohesion part is that if some water gets pulled in, then the water is sticky for other water molecules. And so pulling a little bit of water, other water will potentially come with it for that. And then this other part of the illustration is just showing that sort of keep in mind that cells are wet, but also the cell wall and surfaces around the cells will stay wet because that cellulose is very good at pulling water around them. So we've seen this before. We saw the properties, or we saw the pathways where water can move into the interior of a root. So in from the root hairs to the vascular cylinder. We saw it before and just sort of thought about how water might get there. But I think now that we're thinking about water potential, it gives you a little different perspective. All of this cellulose cell wall here, that's also spongy for water. So these young parts of the root that have a big cortex full of cells, they're able to absorb water from their environment. The root hairs increase the surface area for that absorption, and it gets into basically the cortex of the plant. And then the plants can get water to cross over the membrane. They can transport it into the cells or allow it to come across the cell membrane. And then it's inside of these cells. So we saw the symplastic pathway inside of cells, the apoplastic pathway moving around the outsides of cells, and then ultimately getting through this endodermis and into the vascular system, largely through just the sponginess of plant cells in the root. So another feature that we didn't really think about before, but if you think about what we covered for secondary growth. So as secondary growth happens, the root gets thicker and also sets up more of a barrier to the outside. So the root hairs are really only present in the young roots, and those would be existing at the tips of the root system. And the older parts of the root, they get thicker and they lose their root hairs. They kind of outgrow that cortex portion of the root, and they end up being woodier, so sort of barricaded off from the environment. So older parts of the root are impermeable to the watery environment around them, and only the younger parts of the root really can absorb water into them. And it turns out that has a really nice physical benefit, that having absorption only from the tips ensures that the plants can get water from these tip regions, these farther away regions. You could do an experiment with a straw. If you cut a hole in a straw along its length, then you'd be pulling in maybe some air along the way. That's the danger here, is if the environment is drier near the base of the root. If it was the case where the root system could draw in water from all parts, then it would be unable to really draw water after it had dried out this area. But if the root system is drawing from the tips, then it can draw from these areas that might be deeper, farther away into wetter areas of the soil. And it ensures that extensive root area is able to keep pulling from all parts of the root area, really just by virtue of the fact that the roots are pulling water in only from the younger parts. So the magic of physics. So while we're looking at the roots are able to exert a little bit of pressure. Another way to look at that is that the water potential achieved by the roots, they pull water into them. It's very effective, and it's so effective that it actually generates some physical pressure. So a neat thing about water potential is that these different kinds of water potential are kind of interchangeable. So you can achieve this capillary adhesion movement of water and actually use that to generate pressure. And that's what's happening in the roots. So we didn't talk about physical pressure, but I guess we could add this to our diagram. So you could also move water around by squeezing it out of places or blowing it around, I guess. So root pressure happens when the roots generate enough of this physical pressure that it, you kind of only see it in special cases. So this is on the right, this is a plant that got cut near the ground. You can cut a plant and notice that it's basically shooting sap out, not like rapidly, but oozing sap from the cut parts. That's a result of this pressure that builds up from the roots. So this is water pressure coming in from the soil into the roots. And if you cut the plant, it doesn't have anywhere to go up the plant. So it actually just leaks out, kind of pressurized from the stem. Another feature, this phenomenon happens in a special situation where the environment's a little moist. So this is root pressure in parts of plants that are low to the ground, and usually happens in environments where it's not hot and it's not dry, where these water can basically accumulate without evaporating off. And it's different from dew. It has a pattern that is distinctive and related to the arrangement of the cells on the leaf. So these are actually sort of like water pressure vents that exist on the edge of the leaf. And under these certain conditions where it's just too wet outside in the air for the water to evaporate off, it'll accumulate in this phenomenon that's known as guttation. So just this slide here is illustrating some of the interesting kind of side effects of root pressure. So roots generate their own pressure, but really the bulk of movement, especially in larger plants, the bulk of movement comes from water actually being pulled up from the leaves. And so this altogether is known as cohesion tension, or the cohesion tension theory of water movement in plants. And we've seen cohesion. Cohesion is water molecules sticking to each other. And the idea is that basically there's a continuous chain or stream of water molecules from the roots all the way up to the leaves. And in the leaves, the water molecules are being lost. Some of them get used up in photosynthesis, and that amounts to essentially losing water molecules. Other ones evaporate out through the stomata. So either of these processes causes water to leave from the roots. And because water is connected to other water all the way down this chain of molecules, losing water from the leaf causes it to be replaced from the stem in this chain, like a really long train of cells. So these cells replace, or these, sorry, molecules. These molecules replace these molecules all the way down, ultimately to the source of the molecules. And also over here you can see we saw root pressure, water pressure, water potential. Water potential here values all negative, getting more negative. So these are basically places where water wants to go. So water potential is greatest or closest to positive in the roots and most negative outside in the dry air. So the water, in spite of gravity, of course, pulling it downwards, the other water potential forces are pulling water away from gravity. And of course, we know that plants get water up to the highest parts of even tall trees. Clearly, they're able to do this. So the water potential of pulling these cohesion chains of molecules up to the leaves is great enough that it can overcome gravity. Another factor for this, so it mentions cohesion, but also adhesion and I'll just say capillary action. So water molecules in small tubes, they can stick to the sides of those tubes and that can help with the forces, keep them in place if anything else. So they're also kind of held there, and this cohesion, or the adhesion, sorry, can sort of pull them farther along into the cells as well. So a variety of forces all coming into play here. Here's a nice video illustrating it for you.
How do water and minerals get to the leaves? Although roots can exert a slight upward pressure, it is evaporation of water from leaves, a process called transpiration, that moves water molecules and ions up from the roots. Transpiration exerts a pull that is relayed downward along a string of water molecules from leaf to root. Hydrogen bonds cause water molecules to stick together, a phenomenon called cohesion. As each water molecule evaporates, it pulls on the next water molecule, and it pulls on the next. This relays the pull of evaporating water molecules all the way down to the roots. The adhesion of water to walls of the xylem cells helps to keep gravity from pulling the water molecules back down. As each water molecule escapes from the leaf, it pulls a column of water molecules upward. Solutes are transported along with the water. Thus, the plant xylem uses the movement of evaporating water molecules, cohesion, and adhesion to draw water and dissolved minerals from the soil into its roots and upward to its leaves. Hot, dry, windy conditions increase transpiration. If not enough water moves up from the soil to replace the water lost to evaporation, the plant will wilt and it could die. How does a plant prevent excessive water loss? An opening in a leaf is called a stoma. Stomata are generally open during the day to allow carbon dioxide into the leaf, where it is used in photosynthesis. While the stomata are open, water moves out of the leaf by transpiration. This allows the plant to move water and minerals to the leaf, and the evaporation of water also functions to cool the plant. If hot, dry conditions require the plant to conserve water, guard cells close the stomata. This is a trade-off. Although closing the stomata reduces water loss, this also slows down photosynthesis and may cause the plant to overheat.
Okay, so a nice illustration of the forces at work, and also this ability of plants to respond to situations when maybe losing water through their leaves is not the best plan if they don't have a lot of water available, or if evaporation is a little too intense at the moment. So the video mentioned this compromise. This is a cross-section through a leaf, illustrating, kind of illustrating nicely all the elements that are required for photosynthesis and how they work with the anatomy of the leaf. So cells doing more of the photosynthesis are located in this upper layer, this kind of packed together arrangement of cells. These would have lots of chloroplasts and be ready to do the photosynthesis. The water is made available through these vascular bundles, which correspond to the veins in the leaf. So they're full of xylem and phloem cells, so able to bring water to the cells doing photosynthesis, and also bringing sugar away from the photosynthesis cells. And then through the stomatal pores, which are more often on the underside of a leaf, allow carbon dioxide in and allow water to go out. So here's another, I guess, another water potential feature I didn't mention. Under circumstances where the atmosphere is drier, then water is has some water potential to evaporate. So if the air outside is dry and conditions are warmer, this is going to cause some of this liquid water to evaporate, and that's a way that that water can actually leave the leaf. So as the video showed, under conditions when it's hot and dry, this is when the plant is at more risk of this left-hand process happening, where the water in the leaf will leave the leaf, and that's a cost, that's a risk the plant might be undertaking. The stomata are there. Most often we think of them as being there for getting the carbon dioxide in, but you can't get carbon dioxide in without letting water out if the conditions are hot. So the plants can have a little bit of choice, a little bit of effect on when they have their stomata open. And so plants typically open their stomata more when conditions are moist, and can close their stomata if they're in drier conditions. So they can conserve water, kind of put the brakes on photosynthesis a little bit if the environment outside is too dry. Another way to kind of stretch out the value for the water that's in the leaves is to erect a greater barrier between the moist inside of the leaf and the dry outside environment. And so we typically think of the inside of a plant as being very wet. So even if you're thinking of a dry plant, a dry weather plant, a cactus or something living in the desert, those plants are still pretty wet on the inside. They just do a better job of having barriers between their wet inside and the dry outside. This is an example of a plant that has a neat strategy related to its stomata. This is a kind of an ornamental plant, also very toxic. You might have heard about it, called oleander. It's in the milkweed family. And oleander, on the undersides of its leaves, these are showing the upper surface of the leaf, so it's not very apparent here. More on a microscopic level, the undersides of the leaves have what are called these stomatal crypts. So it's a sunken location, and the stomata, I don't know if I could really, I think this is a stoma right here. We'll go with that. So it's a location where the stomata are located. This is where the plant can get its carbon dioxide in, and they're sunken into these recessed areas that also have a bunch of hairs around them. And so what that does is it creates a greater distance for the dryness, I guess maybe if we go from the other direction, for the moist water vapor to come out of the leaf, to go through the space and finally reach the dry air, gives it a barrier there. So it can kind of have a moister area that's still outside of the plant, but is causing less evaporation from that location. So it gives them greater distance. This is one of the functions of hairs. This is similar to what the hairs on our skin do for us. They hold moist, warm air next to us that allows us to stay warmer. And in this case, that distance allows the moist inside of the plant to stay moist. So just another illustration here. Basically, moving that air around the outside of the plant can cause increased evaporation. And these are illustrating that the air moving, so when the wind is blowing, that causes more evaporation. This is one of the reasons why when the wind is blowing, that makes us feel cooler. Blows off the warm air that's next to your skin a little bit more than if there was no wind. Okay, so that was a little bit about water moving around. Now we're going to switch over to a different topic related to water movement, would be the acquisition of nutrients. So plants get water from the soil. Plants also get nutrients from the soil. And you can break the nutrients that a plant needs into categories of macronutrients and micronutrients, just on the amounts that they need. So this is a table sorted by the concentration, the amount of these that are required by plants. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, as it says here, these are ones that we've seen plants can get from the air, from the water. So plants obviously need water. Plants have usually abundant access to air. So water and carbon dioxide, as you go, typically a little easier to come by for most plants. However, their nutrients, those can be limiting. So these are nutrients that they need a lot of: nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, sulfur. And then micronutrients needed, these are still essential, but in much lower quantities. So these would be something that plants need to get from their environment. Depending on where they grow, they might have a lot of access to this. They might not have a lot of access. And that's one of the reasons that different plants grow in different areas. They can either have better access to nutrients, or have evolved to live with using less of these. So kind of revisiting the idea of a root environment. Plants are getting water through their roots, but they're also getting nutrients from the roots. What is in the soil? So this is a nice microscope image of a little, like a slice of soil. Illustrates nicely, I think, that there's a lot going on. So soil is like a cumulative effect of things falling there, minerals that are already present. So sort of a combination of the rocks in a habitat, rocks that have been weathered down into sand, nutrients that have fallen from plant and animal material, decomposition, all that combined together. So it's, common dumping ground for whatever hits the ground. And as we've seen in the soil nutrients part there, some of the more important nutrients that plants need are these ones that can be abbreviated NPK. So if you buy a fertilizer, these are the nutrients that are given as one number dash the other. It's NPK, which are the elemental abbreviations for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and when you buy your fertilizer, they might be in different ratios. So 7-10-32 is 7% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 32% potassium. I don't know what language this is, but I like change it up a little bit, right? So I mentioned the NPK. We'll go over why those are maybe a little more important for plants. And really all it takes is pointing to the molecules that they are needed for. So nitrogen in a molecule diagram is the blue one. And it shows up in, here are three important kinds of molecules. So threonine is an example of an amino acid. And think about where you've seen amino acids before. They are the building blocks of proteins. So proteins include enzymes, include structural proteins. These are really essential to any cell getting its jobs done. So plants can be short on nitrogen. That would leave them unable to make proteins, unable to make molecules like this one, ATP. So ATP was that molecule very important for transferring energy around inside of a cell. But also ATP is in the category of nucleic acids. So DNA, RNA, again, very central to the function of cells. A lot of nitrogen involved in those. So nitrogen involved in proteins, amino acids, really all the important molecular parts of a cell. And then also this molecule of chlorophyll has nitrogen in it, has this very central location. And then the green, for a little bit of trivia, the green in there is a magnesium ion. So nitrogen, magnesium, very essential here. These other molecules, the black are carbon, the white are hydrogen, red for oxygen, and then we've got some orange phosphorus in there. We'll talk about phosphorus also. So my illustration for this one, you can sometimes find plants that grow in nitrogen poor areas or just nutrient poor areas. And that's one of the places we find our carnivorous plants showing up. So in rare cases, plants will be unable to get enough nutrients from the soil. And sometimes, if they are carnivorous plants, they can actually supplement their nutrients by luring in animals and eating them for their nutrients. So nitrogen has a cycle of getting around in the environment. So same as carbon or other nutrients. You might have covered this in an ecology class. Nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere. Right now we're breathing in and out a whole bunch of nitrogen, but it's not useful to our cells in that form. So N2, this gaseous atmospheric nitrogen, is not biologically useful. So just like we saw with the carbon dioxide, kind of the same thing, it has to be fixed, as we call it. So go through this process of fixation for the nitrogen atoms that are present in the air to become useful as molecules that we can make use of. So ammonium, nitrate, nitrite, these are ones that are biologically useful. So there's a limited number of organisms that can do that. It's a lot of bacteria. So a couple of examples: free-living nitrogen fixers, soil bacteria are able to do that. And in some cases, symbiotic, so bacteria that have arrangements with plant roots can do that. And those increase the abundance of biologically useful nitrogen in the world. And then basically, once it's biologically useful, it can get passed around among organisms. So it's not really illustrated here, but these animals that have their nitrogen, they're going to get their nitrogen from the foods that they eat. So if you eat something that's alive, it has proteins, it has nucleic acids, and that would be a source of nitrogen for you who are eating it. So everything that's not an autotroph has to get its nitrogen from eating something else, right? So we've seen this before. This goes way back to the topic on cyanobacteria. We also had a little bit in our lab on Azolla. There are some plants that partner with bacteria that can do nitrogen fixation. Kind of interestingly, some of these are the cyanobacteria, so bacteria that can do photosynthesis, but plants don't really need them for the function of photosynthesis. But they can use them for the function of nitrogen fixation. So partnering with nitrogen fixing bacteria allows these plants to have a source of nitrogen, just nitrogen out of the air. Like, how awesome is that? So they get nitrogen where even their neighbors might not have access to that nitrogen. Gives them a big advantage in being able to make proteins, to make nucleic acids, and make themselves bigger. So mentioned in the diagram there, these symbiotic soil bacteria. This is a situation where they're partnering with a bacterium that's not cyanobacteria. And this is common across a certain group of plants in the bean family or the legume family. So this is a plant called Facet's locoweed. It's a state endangered plant that I've done some study on. I did not take this lovely photo, but I was fortunate to have it given to me. So plants in the bean family, among their roots, they have specialized what they call nodules. Basically, the plant builds a little chamber and recruits soil bacteria, bacteria that are already in the soil, but it builds them a little house out of root. And the soil bacteria can occupy that space, do nitrogen fixation, and in exchange, the plant gets them some sugar. So similar to what we saw before in the mycorrhizal association, except now it's a bacterium, and the benefit is nitrogen fixation. So moving on to phosphorus. Phosphorus, another essential ingredient. We saw that in the ATP molecule, so phosphorus also present in nucleic acids, DNA, and RNA. And then another really important component of cells is their phospholipid bilayer, right? So the membrane of a cell, the membrane of all the organelles in that cell, those require phosphorus atoms to make up the phosphate parts of those molecules to make up the membrane. So this is another one that's typically obtained from other organisms. There's some natural sources of phosphorus. I think I haven't got anything to show you where phosphorus and potassium show up in the environment, but there are sources for those as well. Potassium is involved in cellular signaling a little bit. It's the ion that's important for causing stomata to increase in size. So here's a nice little tie-in with osmosis. We saw water potential earlier. Plants putting extra getting these mixed up. Extra potassium into the cells causes the osmotic pressure to increase. So more dissolved ions of potassium go into these cells. That draws water in. So the plants pump the potassium in, that pulls the water in, that causes the cells to get bigger, and they basically inflate and push against each other. That causes the pore between them to open. So there's one important function for potassium there. When you get your nutrients and put them into your potting soil, so potting soil itself is not terribly rich in nutrients. So the base for potting soil is typically peat moss or something fibrous like that, not terribly high in nutrients. So I think the more plants I've grown, the more I've realized that supplemental fertilization is an important part of this process. Plants need that. And in simple potting soil, we typically aren't providing that for them. Other things you might find in your potting soil include perlite and vermiculite. These are useful for vermiculite a little bit more for water retention. So if you want your potting soil to hold on to water for longer, vermiculite's a nice additive you can put in there. Perlite, a little bit of more of a contrast for better drainage. So roots, depending on the plant, some of them prefer to have water around them almost all the time. Some roots, for plants growing in dry areas, they really enjoy well-drained soil. So depending on whether you need water retention or water drainage, you can amend your soil with one of these additives. And then, as I mentioned, you probably want to add some kind of fertilizer during the life of your plant, and you might notice a pretty big difference in how well it grows. So these nutrients that are in the soil, they are potentially present, and even if they're present, they might not be available to the plant. So depending on what the nutrients are, some of them are basically kind of locked up at the extremes of pH. So to the left here, we have low pH, which is more acidic. To the right, we have high pH, which is more basic or alkaline. And in the middle, so neutral of 7 or this highlighted 6.2 pH, these are areas where nutrient availability is really maximum for all these. So if your plant is short on nutrients, it may be out of nutrients in the soil. It could be that the nutrients are there, they're just not available. And it's kind of an interesting trade-off here. So if your plant is in soil that's too acidic, that locks up some of these more major nutrients. And at the bottom there are nutrients that are a little more on the trace nutrient side. So on the top here, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So as with many things, the ideal soil pH is right there in the middle. So some people have to add peat moss. Peat moss adds some water retention, and also, as you can see on here, has a lower pH. So in our environment, we're faced with soils that may be a little more alkaline, a little more basic. And so depending on what you're trying to grow, you might find a benefit from adding some peat moss to the soil to kind of even out the pH a little bit more. So it kind of serves as a pH buffer as well. So this is an illustration of one of the reasons why it can be hard to get nutrients from the soil if the pH is not right. This is showing sort of a schematic of a soil particle. Soil particles are able to hold on to mineral ions. So we've got calcium, magnesium, and potassium there. And they're sort of stuck to the soil particle. And while they're stuck to the soil particle, the plant may not be able to make use of them. So in more acidic soils, these are maybe more available. The H+ ions are a feature of acidic soils. And also turns out that plants can emit or exude hydrogen ions like this. So they can basically acidify or kick out some of these other ions, like potassium here, and trade one positively charged ion for another. So let's say we've got soil particles that are rich in calcium, and calcium is something the plant needs, then it can basically kind of trade ions to get those calcium. So the net charge is the same, but say trading H+ ion, 2 H+ ions might get you a calcium ion. So plants can sort of alter the chemistry of their environment and use that to pick up ions that were not available otherwise. You might have, if you're growing plants, you might have experienced plants that are looking a little bit yellow. Yellowing of a plant has a fancier term called chlorosis. And for better or for worse, it seems like there's a lot of information on growing marijuana plants well. So you can take what you learn about marijuana and maybe extend it out to your more legal house plants. But this is a nice illustration anyway of a plant that's got a lot of uniformly green leaves in the background and this one leaf that's got some yellowing on it. And the pattern of yellowing can be useful for identifying the kind of nutrient deficiency you have. And this relates to something interesting in plants where some nutrients can be relocated from parts of the plant to other parts of the plant. Only some of them. So some of these nutrients are called mobile nutrients. And so if the plant is short on calcium or nitrogen, it can take it from older parts of the plant and distribute the nutrients to newer parts of the plant. And this benefits, if a plant is growing up, typically the upper parts of the plant might be in a better position to do photosynthesis. They might be taller, have better access to light. And the lower parts may be a little more structural and less important to have their leaves functioning for photosynthesis. So one strategy the plants might employ is to get rid of to take the nutrients from the lower parts, the older parts that don't need them as much, and move those nutrients toward newer parts of the plant, really to avoid having no nutrients available to build new organs. So the features you would see, as it mentions here, if you have a deficiency in a mobile nutrient, is that those nutrient losses are shown in the older tissues. So symptoms start at the bottom. So the chlorosis, you would see that in older parts of the plant. And these are some examples of nutrients that are deficient and mobile. So let's say you've got yellowing in an older part of the plant, then you can narrow it down and say, well, that's a part, I must be deficient in one of these mobile nutrients. In contrast, the immobile nutrients, basically once they're put into tissues, they stay there. So that includes zinc, manganese, iron, sulfur. And if the plant runs out of those, it can't move them around from old tissues to new. And so you see that the old tissues might remain green and healthy looking, but the newer tissues are yellowing because the plant has run out of that nutrient. So I'm not very good myself at looking at a plant that's yellowing and saying, oh, I know exactly what's wrong with it. But this would maybe help you narrow it down a little bit to either, again, adding these nutrients back if they're missing, or potentially you might have a soil pH issue that is locking up some of these nutrients, keeping them from being available to the plant. Okay, so we're going to come back around again to the function of the cells that are moving the water and the sugar around. So xylem and phloem. We talked about developing xylem and phloem before, and I want to talk a little more about function of xylem and phloem right now. So xylem cells, review what we know about xylem. So xylem. Xylem cells are, if you remember, dead at maturity. So basically empty of anything except for water. And they have a thick wall and has this molecule lignin in it. So as the xylem cells mature, Some of the more extreme versions are like short and fat. So some of them are rather, have a large opening at one end, or both ends. Diagram, a little dotted area showing the parts of this on the inside. So they can be short and fat. Sometimes xylem cells are long and skinny. So still fairly open at the ends. And they're like little bits of pipe. So on these very large plants, you would have transport of water all the way up from the roots to the canopy of this tree. And this water transport is a series of individual cells that are each really just big on a molecular level. So lots and lots of cells are sort of big on a microscopic level. Lots of cells put together, all connected together and achieving this common goal of moving water upwards. But individually, cells that they're long, but not like terribly, I don't know, not so long you'd like stretch them out to several inches or anything like that. So the functions of the xylem cells, having them hollowed out, that allows them to be devoted entirely to moving water through here. The thickness, as we saw before, helps in support of the organism. And they might have some special features, such as pits or holes, so connections with them and their neighboring cells. So illustrate one of those. What was shown in one of those images was it was like a storm drain. So sometimes they have this ending where they're kind of closed off that's still mostly open, but has like a screen of cell wall modifications. And the danger there, see how well I can do this. The danger in having these cells transport water is that they might end up filled with air instead. And if they're filled with air, they can prevent any water from getting through. So let's say this one cell here is full of air. Having an air bubble in the water stream potentially would plug up the water stream. So these grates at the end, if there's an air bubble in there, can basically isolate the air bubble here. Isolate the air bubble inside of this cell. This one cell is compromised, but the air doesn't block the whole water stream. So that's one of the big advantages there of having them with these perforations at the end. Another feature that you find with the pits, some of the pits have an interesting structure. So if we have two neighboring cells, they can be connected by pores here. So again, the xylem cells are working together. They might need to trade water in between them, but they need a system where if one of them is compromised, it doesn't affect the whole water stream. So if you look at one of those pits, sometimes they're what we call bordered pits, where they're modified with this kind of barrier arrangement in the cell wall. So thick cell wall, two adjacent cells. So let's see if I can, there we go. So that's what's being shown here. This is a section through the boundary between two cells. And that disc there that looks like it's floating, that's actually an important part of the process. This is it, or a similar structure from the side. So there's like a disc of hardened cell wall connected, so with some support strands holding it in place. So sort of floating in the center, held in place. And what happens is if you get, how fast I can do this one. So if you get, let's say we have air in one cell and water in the other, then the air, let's say the air is trying to rush out into another cell. If it has this disk in the center, if there's pressure difference, the pressure difference will cause that piece of cell wall there to slam against one side and be held there by this structure. And it's basically a plug that can keep it in place. If the pressure difference is, if the pressure is about the same, there's no real pressure difference between these two cells that are next to each other, then the water can move equally between them. But there's a situation where the pressure is different. I don't remember if water or air is more pressurized in this situation, but let's say whatever the pressure is doing would drive this stopper into the barrier and can prevent that air from leaking out anywhere. So that's what's being described here, these two terms, cavitation and embolism. Air embolism is a way to describe air in the water stream. Embolisms, you can also have those in humans. If you get air in the bloodstream, you might have heard that's a very dangerous potential problem for humans. So air in the water stream, also a potential problem for plants. So a little bit better illustration here than what I had, highlighting this barrier at the end of one cell can sometimes isolate the air. If the air is isolated, the water that's remaining inside of these other cells can go around. So it's kind of important to be able to isolate the problem to keep it from becoming more of a problem later on. I won't show it in here, but plants have the ability, if water becomes abundant again, this happens sometimes when water is scarce or sometimes under freezing, you get these air pockets moving in. Plants can actually dissolve the air back into the water stream if they've got enough time to recover from that. All right, so that was xylem, some interesting adaptations in the xylem cells. In the phloem cells, the function is much different, right? So these phloem cells are devoted to moving sugar particles. So xylem and phloem work together. Xylem would be the source of the water, but the phloem is actually helping the sugars to move. So the sugars are coming from the leaf cells, and their long-term destination, let's say, is a root cell. And the process of moving the sugars down the plant is a process of osmosis and physical pressure. So the cell, this is a cell that's often associated with phloem cells. It's called a companion cell. This can actively pump these sugars and other resources into the phloem cell. As this phloem cell gets full of sugar, then it has an osmotic effect where it draws more water in. So if this xylem cell is pumping, say, rainwater, which doesn't have a lot of things dissolved in it, then the water is going to be drawn toward the cell that has lots of sugar molecules in it. And the pulling of water into this cell causes the pressure to increase. So physical pressure will push that downwards, pushes it down all the way until it reaches low down in the plant where the solutes, things dissolved in there, the sugars are less. And then also through transport, the cells in the phloem can transport the sugars out and make them available to cells that need them. So nice little combination of water potential features there. And just to illustrate kind of an interesting phenomenon, if you have a semi-permeable membrane and some time, you can put a salty or sugary solution on one side and a more dilute solution on the other side. And it's actually going to draw the liquid in from one side, again, against gravity. So that osmotic pressure is great enough that it can actually overcome gravity to make these water levels different. So if you want to see an illustration of that, this is a YouTube I found on YouTube. So time lapse here. So starting from water at the same level, but the left-hand liquid has more dissolved in it, is pulling water across the membrane into that part of the liquid and causing it to go up against gravity. Amazing. And if you're interested in plant physiology, this is I find it really interesting, just this idea of kind of applying physics to plants and plants solving physics problems with, without a brain, without really a lot of active responses, just by building the right kinds of tissues. So I won't get into details about this, but this is a paper that I thought it was nice to relate to what we've just talked about, because it was able to take a plant and actually measure these water potentials across the various parts of this plant from root to the shoot tip.